Welcome to the Autonomic Healing Podcast. I'm Tom Pells.
And I'm Ruth Lawrenson. We'll be unpacking what it looks like to activate your brain to holistically manage stress and trauma that bring healing to the mind, body, and spirit.
Being free to live authentically as humans.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started. We're here talking about trauma. Last episode, we opened up this topic of trauma, Tom, didn't we?
Pandora's box.
Pandora's box.
Yeah.
What it is, how it impacts us as human beings. You know, it's a word that, years ago no one talked about, and now a lot of people are talking about, but we wanted to kind of just take a deeper look at the problem that so many of us face. It's something we call the human condition, which is a lot of trauma that many people have experienced. But before we dive into some of the ways that autonomic healing activation can really help, because that's what we're here for, really, the healing. Yep. So we're going to chat in this episode about the impact that trauma can have on us, in our bodies, in our minds, and our spirits. But before we start, we just want to say to you guys, our listeners, that we know this topic of trauma can just be triggering for people. So if you have unresolved trauma and are listening to an episode talking about trauma is going to be detrimental to you, and you know it deep down, we just invite you not to listen. Just skip this one. You can always come back and listen further down the line. Or if you do wind up listening to this and you end up feeling a little triggered, just encourage you just to reach out for help. So thank you, Tom, for being here and bringing your expertise into this space, because it is a really, really layered topic, trauma. Yeah. But I'm just curious if you want to just kick us off.
Yeah, I'm at this moment, the thought involuntarily in my mind is, this is one of those moments where I like to say, I know more about things I wish I didn't know anything about, but it's helpful that I do.
Yeah.
And I wish I didn't know all of this, really. But I do. So, when it comes to the impact of trauma, that's a rather complex issue. And that is a huge understatement. So, when it comes to trauma, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger is often quoted and is a very popular song. And it's often quoted to describe the effect something traumatic can have that actually contributes to a sense of resilience. What doesn't kill me, what doesn't kill you, makes you stronger.
Is that Kelly Clarkson's song?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. But what you're saying there is just that there's something about the resilience that can come through hard times, right?
Yeah.
So, it can
what
actually
doesn't kill you makes
character.
you stronger. Well, the original quote, interestingly, was so famously expressed by the 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. It is in German, was mich nicht umbringt, macht mich stärker, which can be translated as out of life's school of war. What doesn't kill me makes me stronger.
Wow.
For many people, trauma does have that effect. What doesn't kill you in life's school of war can indeed make you stronger, which is why it is so often termed, in clinical terms, a potentially traumatic event, or PTE.
I've never heard of that before. That the first phrase of that, out of life's school of war. I mean, what a statement.
Yeah.
That is, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. So we've got something called potentially traumatic events, or PTE, which again I didn't ever hear of. But so does that mean that not all traumatic events then lead to someone being traumatized?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Which is why two people can be in the very same experience, and one person is horrendously traumatized by it, and the other person isn't.
So could you speak a little bit more about why that happens? Like, what is the difference between the two people then?
That the nature of the background and the context of life that the person is experiencing it in is determinative of whether that's a traumatic event or potentially traumatic but wasn't. Is it traumatic? Yes. what is the impact of it is context and prior life experience. So that it can be, and we like as human beings to use even the worst things in a productive way. And it's almost a way of reframing it for people to normalize trauma and see it as potentially beneficial. It doesn't kill me, makes me stronger. That's why there's a school of thought that shows up in many different situations: parenting, the military, business. I even had a client where it was in the realm of personal improvement, that toughening someone up with a bit of hardship is beneficial. Knowing that trauma may produce resilience, people think that to be a beneficial strategy. And for some people in some settings, it can be and is. For many others, though, it is simply detrimental and compounds previously existing stress and trauma. That's why they're called potentially traumatic experiences, because not everyone who experiences trauma is traumatized by it, but many are.
So talk about the differences then in terms of what would, you're talking about the like maybe the history of a person, the environment around them. So I'm imagining the people, right, that can help them figure out that event.
Absolutely.
So I guess or not.
Or there
so
isn't
if you've got, a child that's, had a traumatic event at school and that comes home and has parents who talk it through with them and are attuned to that child, and potentially, even though that was a traumatic event, they don't become traumatized by it.
Or even that child's connection with their own body and the natural things that occur in their body experienced as upsetting, traumatic, and there's something wrong? Or is it, this is just what my body is doing to help me adjust?
Yeah.
So, and it also makes a difference what age we are when we experience trauma and the nature of the trauma itself.
Yes.
It's interpersonal, environmental, sexual, physical violence, death, and loss all seem to have different impacts and are experienced by the person based on their life context and whether they have support for managing it, for it turning into something beneficial, or don't. All of those things are why potentially traumatic events and a whole bunch of others are make you stronger or kill you.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, okay, obviously that it seems that the younger you are has a bigger impact, and then also the type of trauma, and then also the type of environment that you're in. So can you just unpack a little bit more? I just like to know a little bit more about some of those things.
A 2000 study compared the prevalence rates of various psychiatric disorders in persons with first onset of a potentially traumatic event in childhood, persons with first onset of a potentially traumatic event or PTE in adulthood, and those with no history of a PTE in representative samples. So it's comparing those three groups.
Okay.
One group, a PTE in childhood. Another group, a PTE with no childhood, but PTE in adulthood, and
not
people with no history of PTE. Interestingly, and this is consistent with other studies, the study found that exposure to a lifetime PTE was associated with a higher probability of psychiatric morbidity than no PTE exposure. A PTE with childhood onset relative to adult onset was related to lifetime panic disorder, independent of the number of lifetime and demographic differences between the two groups. Childhood interpersonal trauma compared with interpersonal trauma in adulthood was significantly associated with lifetime panic disorder, agoraphobia, and post-traumatic stress disorder. The findings suggest that specific mental health disorders are linked to interpersonal trauma and PTEs that occur in childhood rather than later in life.
Huh.
So a growing literature strongly suggests that early exposure to potentially traumatic events disrupts crucial normal stages of childhood development and predisposes children to subsequent psychiatric issues.
Mm-hmm.
A series of epidemiologic studies has demonstrated that childhood sexual abuse is associated with a range of psychiatric disorders in adulthood that includes mood, anxiety, and substance use disorders, even after adjusting for possible confounding variables, such as familial factors and parental psychopathologic disorders or other childhood adversities.
Mm.
There is little evidence of diagnostic specificity of childhood sexual abuse, although a consistent finding has been that alcohol and drug disorders are more strongly related to childhood sexual abuse than psychiatric disorders.
Mm.
Other forms of childhood PTEs have been less well studied. In a national sample of adult women with a history of serious physical assault in childhood experience more lifetime and current episodes of depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and substance abuse compared with women reporting no such victimization. Mm. And in a national sample of adolescents, those who were physically abused, sexually abused, or had witnessed violence had increased risk for current substance use disorders and post-traumatic stress. Mm. Death of a friend has been found to be related to depression, post-traumatic stress, and substance abuse dependence in a representative sample of adolescents.
Mm. That's interesting. So what we're seeing here then is there's such a significant impact when it happens at younger ages.
Yep.
And with these really significant traumatic events like sexual abuse or death of a friend. I mean, we've both talked about how both of us actually had, as children, had friends that died,
mm-hmm.
And how, as children, it's incredibly difficult to process that trauma at the time. And if you don't have people around you helping you process that trauma, that will impact you later on in life.
Because the developing mind and the developing brain can't make sense of it.
So part of the reason is that children's brains are still developing, so they can't process trauma like an adult would process trauma.
Yeah, they can't make sense of it. And so the sense, quote unquote, that they make of it may be nonsense.
Mm.
That if someone I love is at risk, they're going to die. No, they're not.
Mm-hmm.
But that's very real.
Mm-hmm.
So the sense that the developing brain makes of it and the conscious mind's interpretation of it is functionally nonsense. But that doesn't mean it's not real and very impactful. Trauma is often associated with mental health issues, difficulty managing emotions, and a wide range of emotions like anxiety, fear or panic, irritability, frustration or anger, feeling down, sadness or depression, guilt, shame, self-condemnation, uncontrollable urges for things, sex, substances, self-medicating, drugs and alcohol, or self-harming in order to feel something or to connect with the body or to punish or harm self, or being driven to perform at unrealistic levels. Think of the workaholic or performance junkie, and the list goes on of the impact of trauma on mental health.
Yeah.
Or the opposite may happen. The person doesn't experience emotions or has difficulty expressing emotions. A sort of numbness. The strong emotions that occurred with the trauma are seen as a threat. So repress or over-control that. Because the fear is that if experienced, they will be overwhelming and the person will, quote unquote, lose it or go crazy.
Yeah, so a lot of people would just repress that trauma, just be numb to it.
What are you talking about? I have no idea.
Mm-hmm.
Even though you may see them, and clearly they are very angry.
Mm-hmm.
To them, they're not.
So you could have like some people who are, you know, that is so obvious that they're traumatized. They've got anxiety, they're, you know, all of the things you just mentioned, or some of them at least. But then there's other people who are just, no.
Yep.
You wouldn't.
They don't connect.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Or the emotions may swing wildly, sort of Billy Joel's song. Darling, I don't know why I go to extremes. Too high and too low, there ain't no in between. Out of the darkness, into the light, leaving the scene of the crime. Either I'm wrong or I'm perfectly right every time. Sometimes I lie awake night after night, coming apart at the seams, eager to please, ready to fight. Why do I go to extremes?
Thanks for that, Tom. I just want to say, this episode, we're going to have plenty of songs.
Oh, yes. There's a reason that trauma shows up in our music.
It's true.
Because it's trying to find expression. We're trying to express it. We're trying to get it out, external to us. Mm. It's out there, not in here. So his song was actually an apology to his ex-wife, which brings us to trauma and attachment problems. Trauma during childhood can and often does have a devastating impact on adult relationships because they distort social and psychological development. A really curious manifestation of childhood trauma is when a typical childhood developmental phase doesn't get resolved. So with toddlers, there's something called parallel play that occurs developmentally. Parallel play is when you see two or more toddlers, somewhere around 18 months to 2 or 3 years of age, and they play near each other, but are not playing together. They may be mimicking each other or learning from each other, but they're not directly interacting. Mm-hmm. Parallel play is a way children learn things. Yeah. And they learn it from each other. Mm-hmm. But parallel play in adolescence and adults is often also observable, usually as a result of a lack of attachment from a traumatic event. There can be a negative anticipation leading to avoidance and isolation with parallel play in adolescents and adults, that where it appears to be an intimate relationship when it's actually not intimate at all in some fundamental ways.
So, okay, just explain that more. Like, I'm confused. Basically, because of unresolved trauma, there is adults in their intimate relationships, whether that's, I guess, you know, friendships or partners, that they end up parallel playing.
Yes. So it's like living parallel lives when adults are in relationship. So dating, married even, are intimate, but their lives are parallel. Each living their own lives, going about their own things, mimicking, perhaps learning from, but not actually sharing intimately in each other's lives. Not actually interacting with each other in deeper ways. Not sharing the moment, so to speak, but being in the moment together. Like two children seemingly playing together, but not actually interacting. When adults do that, that's trauma. The sensed threat in deeper intimacy is simply too threatening and impactful to be overcome.
So this just has, so actually, you know, what we're seeing here then is trauma has this huge impact in relationships. And I think often people end up being attracted to someone who's equally being traumatized as themselves. Yeah. So if you've got two traumatized people in a relationship, they can easily end up in this kind of the threat of deeper intimacy. Yes. Parallel playing. Yeah. Living out lives, but not quite being able to attain this beautiful space of real intimacy.
And that can look like a very long-lived marriage. but that doesn't mean it was intimate at a deeper level.
Yeah.
Which brings us to attachment and trauma. Attachment is about intimacy and relational connection with others, based on how available a significant caregiver, usually a parent, was, or how they did or did not meet physical and emotional needs. The relational attachment is profoundly shaped and creates our own expectations of what love is and looks like. Here's another song. I'm reminded of Tina Turner's song, "What's love got to do with it? What's love but a secondhand emotion? What's love got to do with it? Who needs a heart when a heart can be broken?"
I went to a Tina Turner concert once.
Did you?
Yeah. It was in Cardiff in Wales.
Color me jealous.
But yeah.
Yeah.
Good choice of words there.
So, a 2016 study titled "The Link Between Types of Attachment and Childhood Trauma" investigated the relationship between childhood trauma and types of attachment and the predictive role of childhood trauma on types of attachment. It was found that the physical, emotional, and sexual abuse and physical and emotional neglect, subdimensions of childhood trauma, were positively related to fearful, preoccupied, and dismissing attachment styles, whereas these same variables were negatively related to the secure attachment style. So, let me explain a little bit about attachment theory. Mm-hmm. And according to attachment theory, primarily the work of John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, there are 4 types of attachment styles that are very much related to the impact of childhood trauma.
And so can I just interject? Mm-hmm. So attachment styles are, obviously they are developed within childhood,
yep.
But then they end up being prevalent with how we relate to others.
We live them out in our adult
lives.
Relationships.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
So there are 4 types. The first is with secure attachment. The person is confident in the intimate connection they have with the other person. They can be and are present and available. They're able and open to sharing their feelings and thoughts, have a desire to authentically connect with the other person. Physical intimacy is desired and mutual, as is emotional intimacy. Mm. With avoidant attachment, also known as dismissive or anxious avoidant, there is a fundamental insecurity that manifests itself in avoiding deeper connection, which may be physical, sexual, or even conversational, and the relationship revolves around activities, hence parallel play. The avoidant person may be dismissive, snotty, snide, negative, critical of the other person in order to avoid intimacy. Or they may be concerned with being accepted or rejected and keep things at arm's length. The underlying dynamic happens because as a child, the relational needs were not met, leaving the child feeling vulnerable. Mm. Either way, the coping strategy is to avoid intimacy because it is not supposed to actually happen.
It didn't happen back then.
And it's not going to happen now, and it shouldn't happen now.
Huh.
And if it does, the person doesn't know what to do with it, while at the same time trying to experience it. So the third one is with anxious attachment, also known as preoccupied or anxious ambivalent. There's a distracted or preoccupied dynamic in the intimacy. The person may seem bemused, inattentive, distant, or easily flustered or worried, or they may be clingy and dependent. The person may seem at times a million miles away and is certainly not present, even if they're standing in front of you. Or they may focus on activities, work, performing as substitutes. The underlying dynamic happens because as a child, the relational needs were inconsistently met. So sometimes they were met, sometimes they weren't met.
Mm-hmm.
So as an adult, the same inconsistency reappears. So the person may completely avoid intimacy at times, or sabotage a relationship when it seems to be developing, or get into a relationship that is doomed, or survive without it. Avoid emotional closeness or relying on others, or avoid physical expressions of intimacy.
So yeah, this is just incredibly insecure with them. They just don't know what's happening.
Yeah, and it was because it was inconsistent as a child. That same inconsistency shows up as an adult.
Okay.
So the last of the types is with disorganized attachment. So disorganized attachment, also known as fearful avoidant, it's just chaotic and inconsistent. Think of a combination of clingy and possessive while avoiding intimacy at the same time. It's very confusing. I liken it to Dr. Dolittle, push me, pull you, and having a relationship with a push me, pull you. Disorganized attachment types have a tendency to put up walls in relationships, push me, while at the same time having a very strong need for intimacy, pull you. So the underlying dynamic happens because as a child, the only source of safety was also the source of threat and fear. So seek the safety, but fear the source of safety at the same time.
So would you find this attachment style coming out of, children who would have been abused by their parents? Or so the very
or
people,
a caregiver.
Or a caregiver, yeah. Yep. So the very people that were supposed to provide the safety were the abuse. That's where the abuse came from.
Yeah. So, and if the impacts on mental health weren't enough to consider, there is the physical impacts as well. It's very common that trauma will show up in physical complaints and problems. Often, the first time someone may begin dealing with trauma is when they wind up at a doctor's office. And unfortunately, until recently, doctors were not prepared for that.
I think now we're seeing that doctors are actually asking the questions, aren't they?
Yeah, because it's been included in medical school education that you're the first line of counseling, except they're not trained as counselors, and oftentimes they don't refer. They just medicate because that's what a doctor would do. So we've talked a little about how trauma will show up in the body, and the term for that is somatization, which is way better than psychosomatic and hypochondria. Having a doctor tell you it's all in your head is not helpful. No. Common physical disorders and symptoms, because it's not all in your head, it is in your body, and somatization is that, include but are not certainly limited to body complaints, sleep disturbance, gastrointestinal, cardiovascular, neurological problems, aches and pains in the bones and joints, breathing difficulties, skin problems, urological problems, and substance use disorders. Those are very real. They are in the body.
And they're caused by trauma.
But they're not a disease.
Yeah.
It's not an illness per se. It is a manifestation of stress that's simply in the body. And curiously, for a variety of reasons, in some cultures, physical complaints are actually rewarded rather than having emotional or psychological issues. If my body is hurting, that is an entirely different matter than if my mind is, or I'm struggling emotionally with anxiety, depression, or anger.
So what do you mean by that? I'm just curious.
In some cultures, physical illness, maladjustment, difficulties, that's okay. Yeah.
But the mind is like not okay.
No. We don't go to the mind. We don't go to the emotions because that's not okay.
Yeah, so it's like, if you break your leg,
yes,
you're going to take at least a couple of weeks off work because you've broken your leg and you can't walk.
Yeah.
But then, actually if you're broken from trauma, and which will have similar,
Can
it can
yeah.
have physical impacts
Or may not.
but I think if we could see it as obviously as a broken leg, we would treat it differently.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so in some cultures, that's why somatization is much more prevalent than in other cultures. Because there's no option.
So do you think that then that it's just like almost subconsciously
Yep.
trauma is coming out physically because people need help.
Yep.
So
it's going to show up someplace.
It has to show up.
And if the only acceptable place socially
mm-hmm.
is in the body, then get sick.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not feeling well. Okay. Why? We're not touching. And we try to find a medical solution.
Mm.
But it's not a medical problem.
Mm-hmm.
It's a trauma problem.
Mm.
But trauma isn't medicatable.
And I remember talking to you ages ago about just even, there are some, people have gone blind and, there's some really significant physical things that have happened from, psychological problems.
Yep.
It's fascinating.
So, for a variety of reasons, in some cultures and within subcultures within other cultures, physical complaints are actually rewarded rather than having emotional or psychological issues. If my body is hurting, that's a different matter than if my mind or I'm struggling emotionally. So that is what is so confusing to people. When we make the body carry the impact of trauma in somatization, it's very confusing because when the medical tests and evaluations show nothing is wrong and fail to confirm the ailment, but the person is very aware of the pain, that's very confusing to them.
Mm-hmm.
So there is also the case when trauma does cause actual physical symptoms, but the root cause is still trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Think of an ulcer, which I had when I was in graduate school the first time. A very real physical medical problem, but that was stress and trauma.
Caused by stress and
trauma. And if you don't treat the stress and trauma, you may even resolve the physical complaint, but then the trauma is just going to show up someplace else and somewhere else and in some other way. What we're talking about is also described as adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs.
Yes.
And that's been increasingly studied. An original study occurred between 1992 and 1995 of 45,000 adults in the relationship of childhood abuse and household dysfunction to many of the leading causes of death in adults. The Adverse Child Experiences Study, ACEs. There were 7 categories of adverse childhood experiences that were studied: psychological, physical or sexual abuse, violence against mother, or living with household members who were substance abusers, mentally ill or suicidal, or ever being imprisoned. The study was to assess the impact of childhood trauma on the following outcomes in adults: disease risk factors and incidence, quality of life, healthcare utilization, and mortality. In other words, death. Just a few of the findings I find stunning. They found a strong relationship between the number of childhood exposures of those 7 and the number of health risk factors for leading causes of death in adults. Another, both the prevalence and risk, even adjusted for odds ratio, increased for smoking, severe obesity, physical inactivity, depressed mood, and suicide attempts as the number of childhood exposures increased. The prevalence and risk, again adjusted for odds ratio, of alcoholism, use of illicit drugs, injection of illicit drugs, having greater than 50 intercourse partners, and a history of sexually transmitted disease increased as the number of childhood exposures increased.
Wow. So what we're seeing here then is that not only does childhood trauma really impact our attachment styles with our adult relationships, but then what we're seeing is it really impacts our bodies, like hugely.
Health.
Not just that it's coming up in our bodies, but actually just like the trajectory of health. Yeah. Wow.
And it's not just the body and relationships that are impacted by trauma. It is the mind and perceptions as well. Perhaps particularly so, and even more than the body and relationships having a detrimental impact. We all have what I call seemingly rational perceptions. In other words, the perceptions seem rational to us of ourselves, others, and situations. They make sense, but are suspected to not be, or even obviously are not to others. To others, they're obviously nonsense. But to the person, they're not nonsense. That is how things are.
Yeah.
The way we think about ourselves, others, and situations is modeled for us as children and rewarded by the significant people and experiences we have, particularly during childhood. And while the seemingly rational perceptions are completely understandable, as well as consistent and predictable, they show up in the tsunami of stress, they are to one degree or another distorted from the way things actually are, leading to what I call negative anticipation. Because of the way we are habituated to think about ourselves, others, and situations that's not actually rational, something triggers then a sense of stress and need. And what triggers a stress and need is often a perceived threat to well-being that often does not actually exist, but is sensed and perceived to be just that. It is the prior association of the current situation with a prior traumatic event that leads to the anticipation of a negative outcome.
Yeah.
Like the Vietnam War vet having a panic attack when seeing my desk lamp, because the yellow light was similar to the yellow light from the explosion of a rocket hitting the bunker he was sheltering in decades ago. Or the professional who, because of a tendency toward a perfectionism that was unrealistic, irrational, and unattainable, but nevertheless expected by parents, fears making a mistake and berates themselves for even the slightest missteps.
Yeah. So what we learn in childhood, whether it's wherever we are on the trauma spectrum, will affect our perceptions, the way we see things.
And our cognitive performance.
Yeah.
We're just not performing terribly well because there's an impairment. And that isn't just into adulthood, that's throughout life. So in a 2018 article in the Journal of Clinical Psychiatry titled "Childhood Trauma is Associated with Poorer Cognitive Performance in Older Adults," childhood trauma is common and associated with both worse cognitive performance and disruptive to the HPA axis in younger adults. The extent to which these associations persist into older adulthood remains unknown. The aim of the current study was to investigate self-reported childhood trauma in relation to cognitive performance and the extent to which cortisol explained this association in 2 independent samples of older adults. Now, just a side note.
Okay.
Cortisol is the primary stress hormone.
Yeah.
It increases sugar, glucose in the bloodstream, energy, flight or fight, you gotta have energy. Enhances your brain's use of the glucose and increases the availability of substances that repair tissues. If you're in flight or fight, repairing tissues.
It's helpful.
Oh, yeah. Cortisol also curbs functions that would be non-essential or harmful in a flight or fight situation. So it inhibits things that are not helpful in flight or fight. Now, because of that, the study considered cortisol as a factor in cognitive functioning related to trauma. In this cross-sectional study, participants in the discovery sample consisted of older adults with a DSM-4 diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder. Generalized anxiety disorder is just what the name seems to suggest.
Yeah.
And age-equated psychiatrically healthy comparison subjects. So people with generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD, and people who didn't have those.
Yeah.
Okay? And they were referred largely through primary care clinics between 2004 and 2006. The replication sample consisted of older adults with DSM-4 anxiety or depressive disorder in 2011. Participants were administered the Early Trauma Inventory Self-Report short form, and a neuropsychological assessment was completed. The results was that across both samples, childhood trauma was significantly associated with worse performance on measures of processing speed. In other words, how quickly and efficiently can the person process information?
Yeah.
Attention, and executive functioning. The effect of trauma exposure was stronger when specifically examining general, physical, and sexual traumatic events. Childhood trauma was not associated with cortisol levels.
So that had nothing to do with it.
Nope. And cortisol did not explain the association between trauma and cognitive functioning. So the conclusion was that self-reported traumatic events experienced in childhood are associated with poorer cognitive performance in anxious and depressed older adults. And there are a lot of them. Findings demonstrate a deleterious impact of childhood trauma on brain health in old age.
Wow.
So we'll look into that more extensively in future podcasts on the cognitive homeostasis that the brain makes possible in AHA problem solving, where quite literally the brain is the therapist.
And I think that's so important to say at this point, because obviously we're looking at all of the detrimental impacts of trauma, and, you know, it can feel a little depressing at this point, right?
It's or fear-inducing.
Yeah, so I think, you know, again, if you're listening right now and you're like, oh my gosh, I had trauma as a child and this happened to me, and so what does that mean? Am I going to be like, and you know, are my relationships going to be a disaster? My health, you know, not got a great prospect, and
or I'm in a relationship with someone,
or the cognitive
and I'm
stuff.
seeing all this stuff showing up in their lives. What do I do with that? How do I make sense of that?
Totally, but I just want to kind of interject here and just say, you know, I think the point of what we're doing here in AHA is that there is this incredible way forward, and change can happen. This doesn't have to be the future.
No.
This can change. There can be healing. There is hope. So I just want to say that to anyone who's listening right now, who is thinking, oh my gosh, like you've just described all of these like hard things that probably I identify with if you've had trauma in your life. But when we start resolving trauma through AHA, we can see this type of healing
because
happen.
We're activating homeostasis. And that's that normalizing, healing function that is in all our brains.
And
it's
it
just
can happen
giving it a chance
in the body and in the mind and in the spirit.
Yep.
So great.
So, related to the mind, rather than the seemingly rational problem solving we are prone to, because of those prior modeling, imposing, because of trauma, etc., that we're prone to do with our minds, which often simply produces increased stress when the solutions we come up with these seemingly rational problems can be worse than the problems that started it. It's like when we make a mountain out of a molehill, the brain itself does not do that. To the brain, a mountain is a mountain and a molehill is a molehill. To the mind, that molehill is a mountain and it's going to come crashing down on me.
So there's an impact there on the mind, then the way we see things.
Yep.
That has to be that needs to be normalized.
Yes.
And the brain can bring that normalization.
And then we can function much more effectively cognitively.
Mm-hmm.
We can come up with more rational solutions to problems that have bedeviled us before. Mm-hmm. Because the brain itself and seeing the patterns can be really helpful to intervention. And
that's why you call them seemingly rational, because often we don't see them.
No.
Like they to us, it's like,
that
I'm perfectly rational right now.
And to somebody else, it's like, that's crazy.
Yeah.
What are you talking about?
But as we go through AHA, you begin to see the patterns of these seemingly rational perceptions. And by just even seeing them, there's an ability then to change. To bring different ways.
New solutions present themselves. And then we're not only not creating more stress, we're actually reducing it. And that's the AHA problem solving, which will come up in another episode. And then there is the spiritual impact of trauma. When we experience stress and need in our very being, our sense of identity and significance. Trauma can distort our view not only of the world we inhabit, but the inner world of our spirit. That war that can go on within us, in our very spirit. And it doesn't make us stronger, it just kills us. So throughout history, there is a reason that the corporate expression of our individual spirit in a religion that has been all about love and peace can wind up propagating hatred and conflict. Freedom can be redefined if the religion is political. Why does this happen? The cause is so often traceable to unaddressed trauma that is collectively experienced and reacted to. We're seeing that throughout the world.
Yeah.
We've seen that in the United States, where there are attacks on the government and it's minimized as civil unrest or something. It's just, no. So Nietzsche, who
Back to Nietzsche.
said, what doesn't in this war, right?
Yeah.
What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. He was actually, interestingly, also a fatalist. Yes. Sort of the other version of that is what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But if it does kill you, fatalistically just accepting you're not going to be stronger. You're going to be dead.
Yeah, not the greatest of wisdom there.
No. And we're really talking about pathways to healing and change.
Yeah.
That's really what we're talking about. And with subsequent episodes, we're going to be talking about seemingly rational perceptions and how, for the brain, we can actually have actually rational perceptions. And the difference is between a caricature of ourselves that the seemingly rational perceptions result in, as opposed to an authentic self.
Yeah.
That is actually rational.
Totally. And I think that's the aim, isn't it? You know, we see the impact of trauma all around us, probably in our own lives. We see it with, destructive leaders. We see it in big spaces, in family situations. We see it in personal situations. But I think that what is the exciting part of this, Tom, is that what you've just described, that there's this way forward to stop in the tracks of this, this ball of trauma that can literally like ram our lives down. But actually there's tools with autonomic healing. I can't wait for the next couple of episodes because I think we've actually said a number of times now we'll get to the cognitive.
Yep.
And we're actually going to get to the cognitive in the next episode. And it's so fascinating just looking at these, like, you know, some of the seemingly rational perceptions and how we can move into, you know, that space of rational intimacy with the actual rational perceptions, how we can move that. And I've experienced it myself. You've experienced it because you've obviously created it. But it's just like, I love it because it really brings this, I think, you know, with AHA in the somatic space, it just helps so much with normalizing trauma or stress in the body. But when we get into the cognitive or autonomic healing activation, PS we call it, what we start seeing is like how we can change those perceptions, and it's just awesome, brilliant stuff. So stay tuned, guys. We can't wait to be with you next time. And thanks, Tom, for having this conversation.
Very welcome. You've been listening to the Autonomic Healing Podcast.
Join us next time as we continue in our conversations with Tom. If you're interested in pursuing your own autonomic healing journey and want to find a practitioner, visit our website, innerworkings.org. See you at the next episode.